Welcome to the Top Shelf Cookie Sniper Hockey Card Podcast.
Orr for the Bruins, tied up by Ecclestone and Berenson. Westfall rolled it in front. Sanderson tried a shot that was wide, and Keenan cleared it but not out. Bobby Orr behind the net to Sanderson. Orr! Bobby Orr scores for the Boston Bruins. Have won the Stanley Cup. Orr lifting it into the goal goal and lifting the long team down the Bruins as Bobby Orr, their 22-year-old sensation, scores after 40 seconds of overtime. And the Bruins win the Stanley Cup.
And welcome to episode 4 of the Top Shelf Cookie Sniper Hockey Card Podcast. I'm your host, Jay, and we're in for a very exciting episode here today. As you know, today is episode number 4. So what better way to do a 4th episode than to do a whole episode on the greatest number 4 ever, Bobby Orr. But before we get into discussing everything Bobby Orr, just a quick reminder that the Top Shelf Cookie Sniper Hockey Card Podcast is by no way, shape, or form a financial advice podcast. It's simply just a fellow talking about hockey and hockey cards, and specifically today, Bobby Orr. So let's get into it. What better topic could we have for the 4th episode of the Top Shelf Cookie Sniper Hockey Card Podcast than to discuss the great number 4, Bobby Orr of the Boston Bruins. We'll look at some interesting stats and facts from his career, as well going over the various awards he's won, some interesting stories that I found online, and then at the end I will reveal what my favorite Bobby Orr hockey card is in my collection. Okay, so let's start off with Robert Gordon Orr's early career. Now, you have to remember that back then the Bruins were not very good. Actually, they had not qualified for the Stanley Cup since 1959. So here we're around 1965, 1966. Now, they had been scouting young Bobby Orr at the age of 14 years old. Can you imagine that? 14 years old. And an NHL team is interested in you. They went into negotiations with Robert Orr, or Bobby Orr, and his agent, Alan Eagleson. Now, they haggled over a contract for a while, but they eventually agreed on a contract that paid young 14-year-old Bobby Orr $70,000 plus a signing bonus at the age of 14 years old. He then went on to play Junior A hockey with the Boston-sponsored Oshawa Generals of the Ontario Hockey Leagues. Now, moving forward, on September 3rd of 1966, Bobby Orr, at the time an 18-year-old, he signed a 2-year contract to enter the NHL with the Boston Bruins. And this contract was for $40,000 for 2 years, plus a signing bonus. His first game was on October 19th, 1966 against the Detroit Red Wings, and he scored his first goal on October 22nd, just 2 days later, against the hated Montreal Canadiens. As you know, the Bruins and the Canadiens rivalry has been going on for a number of years. It's almost like a Yankees-Red Sox rivalry, but that's where he scored his first goal, was against the Montreal Canadiens. If we take a look at his career stats, where he played 657 games, he had 270 goals, 645 assists for 915 points. Now this puts him at 1.39 points per game. Now that would be a great stat for an offensive player in the NHL. You have to remember, this is the late 60s, early 70s, where defensemen didn't do this. So for Bobby Orr to have a 1.39 points per game is just something unheard of. Again, very impressive for the young defenseman. So why was Bobby Orr so good? Well, right off the bat, everyone knows and everyone recognizes that he revolutionized his position of the game in the NHL. The position of defense, as we mentioned before, was not one that you would have an offensive type of minded player playing that position. They were more of a stay-at-home, protect the house type of thing. Occasionally, maybe they bump up in a rush or something like that, but for the most part, their goals were, took a slap shot and it went in from the point. But not Bobby Orr. He revolutionized it in the way that he had incredible speed and puck handling ability. He could score as well as create plays on the ice. And at the time, this was unparalleled by anybody in the NHL. He used his talents to transform the way the game was played moving forward. His skating speed and offensive prowess made him one of the most influential players in the history of the sport, and his legacy continues to be felt today. I mean, if you really think about it, since Bobby Orr, some of the great offensive defensemen we've seen, such as the likes of Chris Chelios, Nicholas Lindstrom, Brian Leach, Chris Letang, up to today where you have someone like Cale Makar. Without Bobby Orr, these guys might not be the highly offensive players that they are today or were in the NHL. And again, this is all thanks to, as young children, them watching or learning about Bobby Orr and his style of play. An interesting fact about Bobby Orr, he scored 9 hat tricks in his NHL career as a defenseman. 9 hat tricks. Funny enough, the first hat trick he ever had was against the Chicago Blackhawks, who, as we know, eventually he would end up finishing his career with. Now, he actually got that hat trick in the first period. I mean, how often does that even happen in the NHL today with greats like Lemieux and Gretzky? This is an NHL defenseman scoring a hat trick in the first period. Again, just amazing talent. Just in case you were wondering who was behind Bobby Orr, Harry Cameron had 6, Paul Coffey had 5, and Dennis Potvin had 5 hat tricks. Talking a little bit more about his speed, he was one of the only defensemen, again, at that time period, who would lead the rush, or he'd pick the puck up from behind the net or in his own zone and just take off with it. Usually, again, back then, defensemen were looking to pass that thing up as quickly as possible. He was looking to skate that thing up and add his skill to the rush. Where his skating ability also helped him was in the defensive end as well, too. He could cover a lot of ground. Where he really shined was on the penalty kill. There's actually videos out there you can go see where Bobby Orr would pick the puck up and would skate for, 50 seconds, a minute 20, with the puck on his stick, while players chased him and would kill majority of the penalty off by himself, just kind of skating around and just, people couldn't catch him. Now, as we mentioned before, the Bruins hadn't been in the Stanley Cup playoffs since 1959, but once Bobby Orr got there, not only did they make the playoffs, they won their first Stanley Cup with Bobby Orr in 1970, and then his second one with the team in 1972. So again, here's one player making a big difference on a team that was kind of, if we would be in the dumps, and then he comes along and completely helps turn this franchise around. Talking about that 1970 Stanley Cup, I don't know how else to put this, but let's talk about the goal. If you're not quite sure what the goal is, go to YouTube, you young people. Look it up, Bobby Orr, the goal, and you will see one of the most iconic pictures in NHL history. So what the goal was is in 1970, the Bruins played the St. Louis Blues, and I believe it was Game 5. They went into overtime against the Blues. Now, Bobby Orr pinches in, passes the puck to Derek Sanderson, who's just off to the side behind the net. And when Sanderson gets the puck, Bobby Orr rushes towards the net where he's fed the puck from Derek Sanderson, and he proceeds to score the game-winning and Stanley Cup clinching goal against the Blues. Now, once that goal hit the net, the defenseman of the Blues, Noel Picard, proceeds to trip Bobby Orr as he's raising his hands to celebrate, causing him to sail through the air for a brief moment. Well, there was a picture taken, and that caught that moment. That, as I said before, is iconic. Now, that picture is known by many names: the leap, the flying goal, the flying oar, or simply, as I reference it, the goal. Now, here's something interesting. The photographer who took that picture, I believe his name is Ray, I want to say Lussier, Lussier. I want to give credit where credit's due. He's the one that captured the photo of Bobby Orr flying through the air after the Stanley Cup winning goal. And as we mentioned, it remains one of the most famous and iconic pictures in NHL history. So when we discuss Bobby Orr, I don't think anyone can argue that he was a great player. He was also a great person. He was constantly revered as one of the great guys in the NHL. He never turned down an autograph from a young person, and if anything, he actually was known for resurrecting hockey in, I'll say, the Boston area, but I'll say as well as New England and possibly the country at this time. I think it was after he started playing that Boston saw the biggest growth in hockey rinks in the short period of time. Now, I don't know as far as the rest of the country, but again, at that time period in the early or late 60s, early 70s, hockey in the States wasn't so great, if you would. But with his play, definitely drew attention to not only himself, but the Boston Bruins and the NHL as well. So now, moving forward, Bobby Orr actually retired at the age of 30. Sad to say, a great player like this retiring at the age of 30. Why was that? Why did he retire at the age of 30? I mean, it seemed that Bobby Orr could have played at least up into his, mid-30s. He was in excellent shape, but what he cites is he had a knee injury, and that was the primary reason for his retirement. Now, during his time in the league, Bobby Orr actually had 12 knee surgeries and said that because of that, it eventually destroyed his left knee, and he was unable to play not only at the high caliber that he was used to, but play in general at all in the NHL, which caused him to retire at the young age of 30 years old. Could you imagine if that knee was good, what he could have accomplished in the NHL for another, let's even just say 5 more years? I think he could have won many more awards, possibly another Stanley Cup or two, and then possibly even retired as a Boston Bruin. As you know, he was eventually let go and he signed with the Blackhawks. I don't have time to get into that story, but there's an interesting story as to why he didn't sign with the Bruins, and it basically came down to what the Bruins had offered. They were obviously worried about his knees or what have you, but they did give him an offer. But the legend goes is that his agent never told him the full facts of what the Bruins offered, and then at the time the Blackhawks just gave them an amount of money they couldn't turn down. And as you know, if you look at the history, he didn't do much for them, and sadly kind of, went out on a whimper, if you would, after coming in with such a bang. All right, now let's talk about some of the awards Bobby Orr won. He won the Calder Memorial Trophy, which is the Rookie of the Year in 1966. He won 8 James Norris Trophies, or the award for the best defensive player who demonstrates throughout the season the greatest all-around ability at that position. So he won 8 of those. He won 2 Art Ross trophies. That award is the award for the player that leads the NHL in points. He won 2 Hart Memorial trophies, which is the most valuable player to a team. And he won 2 Conn Smythe trophies, which is the league MVP, as well as a James Norris trophy. Now, interestingly enough, he won 3 of those awards in 1 year. He won the Norris, the Art, and the Hart in 1969-1970 season as a defenseman. Never been accomplished again I don't think it will ever be accomplished unless someone comes out of the woodworks that, can really pull off what Bobby Orr did in that short period of time. Bobby Orr is the youngest player to be inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame. He was inducted to the Hall of Fame in 1979 at the age of 31. So, first year after retirement, he went right into the Hall of Fame. In 2017, Bobby Orr was named by the National Hockey League as one of the greatest 100 NHL players in history. And constantly the NHL has acknowledged and paid tribute to Bobby Orr for not only being a great player, but changing the game at his position as well. Now let's look at a couple of really fun stories that I was able to find about Bobby Orr. The first one has to do with Bobby Orr and Gordie Howe. And Bobby Orr actually shared this story that took place in the late 1960s. He says, and I quote, "Early in the game, I got my elbow a little high on him," meaning Gordie Howe. A little later, I was watching one of my pretty passes, looking back, and the next thing I knew, I was on the ice. I had my head down, and he hit me pretty good. Gordie had let me know that he was still the man. Now, he was standing over me, glaring down at me. Now, a bunch of my teammates skated to my defense, and there was a little scrum that broke out. But I didn't want that. He goes on to say, "I told my guys, it's okay. I asked for that. I'll take care of it myself later on." I had asked him about the hit later, and in typical Gordie Howe fashion, he said, "Well, it's better to give than to receive." I think that's a great story from two of the great NHLers in all-time history. The second story that I found very entertaining had to do with what many consider to be the greatest player in NHL history, Wayne Gretzky. Now, when Wayne Gretzky entered the NHL, he looked to Gordie Howe and Bobby Orr for inspiration. Now, during a game, the Great One, or Wayne Gretzky, recalled an incident. He had not taped his stick and attempted to follow in the footsteps of Bobby Orr, who really only had like a single strand of tape on his stick, not very much. Now, Wayne Gretzky proceeded to copy that, and again, wanted to follow in Bobby Orr's footstep by not taping his stick up all the way. Now, upon seeing this, Gretzky's father, Walter Gretzky, jokingly replied, "What are you doing? You're not Bobby Orr." And our third story has to do with one of Bobby Orr's coaches, the great Don Cherry. Now, Don Cherry tells a story that one day at a game in the Boston Garden, number 4, Bobby Orr, and as he says, the greatest hockey player who ever lived, went to shoot a puck in his own zone into the corner. But instead of shooting it wide into the corner, he actually shot it and picked the top corner of his own net. So again, scoring on his own goalie. Don Cherry goes on to say, "There was a deathly silence in the Boston Garden." He said, "Deathly. Nobody knew what to do. I didn't know what to do," Don Cherry said. He mentioned that we all just stood there, and finally somebody from the crowd yelled out, "Don't worry, Bobby. Cheevers, the goalie, should have had it." Now let's take a look at Bobby Orr's rookie card and the value that he has on them today. Bobby Orr's rookie card is the 1966 Topps, number 35. Now, the PSA 8 value, there's no PSA 9s or PSA 10s that I could find. So the highest grade that this card has is a PSA 8. It sold for $52,000 on August 22nd, 2022. Now let's go to the other end of the spectrum where you can actually get a PSA 1 for $2,600. And the last sale of that was on May 17th of 2023. So you can see, if you want a Bobby Orr rookie card, you're going to have to break the piggy bank and really shell out some money for, well, again, one of the greatest players of all time. And finally, let's talk about my favorite Bobby Orr card in my collection. Now, I have a few of them, And this was kind of hard to actually come up with a favorite. It's almost like, who's your favorite child if you're a parent? But I was able to come up with one. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put up a picture of my favorite hockey card on my Instagram account at the Top Shelf Cookie Sniper Hockey Card Podcast on Instagram. So my favorite Bobby Orr card in my collection is a 2010 The Cup Enshrinements Triples Auto. And what this card is, 3 autographs. The first autograph being Bobby Orr, the second one being Phil Esposito, and the third one being Johnny Busick. Now, this card is out of 15, and the number I have is number 2, so 2 out of 15. I put that card up, and I look at that card on a daily basis, and that's one of my favorite. When you have 3 of the greatest Bruins of all time to look at on a regular basis, and with Bobby Orr leading the way, that's not such a bad card to have. There are a number of cards that were a close second. I do not have a Bobby Orr rookie card, but that is something that I hope to have in my possession and my collection one day. And the sound of the siren indicates the end of the period, as well as our podcast as well. I want to thank everyone for tuning in to episode 4, or as we're going to call it, the Orr episode. We had a lot of fun talking about the great number 4 Bobby Orr and learned some interesting little facts about him, as well as his card value today and what my favorite card in my personal collection is of him. I'd like to thank you for listening. If you like this podcast, you know what to do. Like, follow. Please be sure to check out my Instagram account at Top Shelf Cookie Sniper Hockey Card Podcast. And until we meet again, have a good one, and we'll see you soon.